Or the people picture, but otherwise we're good.
Cool.
There's Garrett Gross.
All right. Everyone hear me okay? Hopefully. Awesome. Well, let's get this clicker working. Okay. So let's say that this whole cybersecurity thing doesn't work out for you. Okay. You decide to take a job in physical security. It's a gig where you're in charge of securing a large building downtown. Who doesn't like some sanctioned, B&E, a little breaking and entering? It's a pretty standard gig. You're going to waltz into this place. You're going to identify risk. You're going to build a plan to reduce risk over time. And a great start would be to discover all the egress and ingress points, all the entrances and exits, right? Don't worry though, you're walking into an environment where all the main entrances and exits have already been documented. Well, I mean, documented in a spreadsheet that an intern maintains, right? Well, they're supposed to maintain it, but they've got other jobs, interns, budgets and whatnot. Here's the problem though. The employees in this building have the ability to add entrances and exits as they see fit. And I mean, they're supposed to ask you first, but that's not always possible. Because, we move at the speed of business. We have to make accommodations for different, workflow types, adjustments to the office. And sometimes we have to sacrifice some things, namely safety and security to do so. For instance, there's a room in the building that contains all of our customer information, bank account numbers, credit cards, other PII, stuff like that. And this room is obviously locked so that only you have the ability to access this room, right? It's a problem though. That's also the room where we have our overflow corporate swag, our t-shirts and mugs and stuff. And, sales, it's the end of the quarter, they need to close a deal and they want to sweeten that deal with some swag and you're not around. Well, that's a problem. And that's obviously unacceptable. So sales just added a tiny little unlocked door, just, on just big enough for someone to reach their arm over and grab a mug or something. But don't worry, you can't reach any of the sensitive stuff. That's on the other side of the room. Does that sound good? By the way, your employees are installing on average about 60 new entrances and exits a day. And not all of them are obvious door-like doors. Some of them are windows, some of them are big doors, some of them are small doors. Hell, one guy just like punched a hole in the wall the other day. So, anything's kind of fair game. So how are you feeling about this gig now? Do you feel like you're going to be able to waltz in here and really quantify the risk and be able to build a plan to reduce this risk over time and keep up with this rapid adoption? Obviously, this sounds ridiculous, and I get that, and no one would hopefully no one would actually take this gig. I mean, if you did, good luck to you. And hopefully everyone understands where I'm going with this. This would never fly in commercial, office layout or security, but this is the reality that we face today in IT and security when it comes to the introduction of technology into our environments, especially now that the most common form factor is a SaaS application or a web app or whatever you want to call it. And I'd say that for the longest time, we in security, we thought we had it under control because, we did. This was pre-ubiquitous internet, pre-smartphones, everything that, originated in the environment came from us. So the point of all of this, the whole point of the talk is that, we have a big problem with this introduction of technology into our environments that's evolving and changing and, adding different nuances every single day. But our approach to managing this introduction of technology really hasn't changed much, even since my, humble beginnings back in IT and security. So here's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about SaaS sprawl by the numbers. We'll talk about some different approaches on how to manage this sprawl in your environment. We'll talk a little bit about how this adoption of technology has changed over time, and then, of course, what it looks like today. We'll introduce some various ways that SaaS introduces risk into your environment. Hopefully, I've got some time. We'll, share with you some of the lessons that I've learned in my experience in the field, and then we'll conclude with some of the ways that I recommend how to and how not to manage this risk, or manage or mitigate this risk, however you want to approach that. But first, let's play Two Truths and a Lie. Is everyone familiar with this game, Two Truths and a Lie? Okay. So we'll start out with one. The vast majority of IT and security teams have a pretty good idea of what their users are doing. Thanks, Griff. Today, it's fairly easy to produce an accurate picture of your attack surface. I used to tour with the Blue Man Group. Any guesses on which one of those is the lie up there? Yeah, it's kind of a setup, kind of a trick question. All of those are actually lies. I did try out for the Blue Man Group one time, but that's a story for another time. This was all just kind of a setup for me to argue that due to this rapid adoption of technology that we see in our environments, and the fact that most organizations are not able to keep up with this rapid adoption, you actually have no idea what your users are doing. And it's not feasible. It's actually nearly impossible to produce an accurate depiction of what your attack surface looks like today, since I'd argue that the majority, if not the entirety of your critical infrastructure is now housed in SaaS applications. And, while this isn't the point of this talk, I'd say that this perfect storm that we're in right now, where we've got this rapid adoption of technology, this inability to, quantify the risk, it makes it a lot easier for more highly motivated and funded threat actors to, to compromise your environments. And keeping up with that and defending that is harder than ever. But that's another talk that I should probably do. But here's some real stats to actually drive this point home. Yeah, and by the way, if you've got comments, shout them out. I don't care. I don't mind getting interrupted. Hopefully everyone here is familiar with Gartner, our friends who developed the Magic Quadrant. In 2018, Gartner predicted that 1/3 of all successful cyber attacks will be on data stored in shadow IT infrastructure. Fast forward 3 years, in 2021, studies were showing that more than 50% of technology budgets actually sit outside of IT. Well, it's easy to fix. Just tell them to stop adopting stuff, right? Fast forward to 2023, a study showed that 74% of employees said that they would have no problem bypassing your cybersecurity guidance if it helped them achieve a goal or complete a project or any other kind of business objective. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, good point. I'm sure pretty much anyone would be okay skirting your cybersecurity guidance, but yeah, based on the respondents, those are the ones that were actually truthful about that.
I venture that 80% of security professionals would bypass security guidance if it helped to meet their objective.
A funny side note that some of the top offenders are folks that are in this room of this makeup. We tend to bend our own rules, right? Which, again, that's probably another topic. But all this builds up to the statistic that 98% of cloud services today are adopted without any IT oversight. So if we go on the stat earlier of, 60 new SaaS assets are introduced, I think it's in a company average of 1,000 employees. If 60 assets are introduced daily, that means that for every app that you know of, there are 59 that you don't. So let that sink in and just really scare the crap out of you a little bit. And then I thought I'd throw in the fact that on average, we waste about $135,000 a year on software. And, this is unnecessary software licenses, stuff that's not getting used, stuff that you forget about. So this SaaS sprawl is not only presenting a pure play security risk, but also a financial risk to your organization, which can, erode the bottom line over time. And of those of you who have been in IT and security for a while, we're kind of known as that black hole that you just throw money into. So this just kind of exacerbates that notion. Why am I mentioning this though? Well, because the average IT salary in the United States is about $90,000 to $100,000. So if the average organization could get a hold of this SaaS sprawl, you could afford 1, maybe 2 full-time employees to tackle other projects like, nice to have things like DLP and, privilege access management, stuff like that. So a lot of opportunity to actually save some cash. And then just for grins, I thought I'd ask ChatGPT to come up with some better ways that we could spend $135,000. I don't want to go through all of them, but some of the highlights include gold-plated staplers, because regular staplers just don't really demonstrate that commitment to opulence, right? Zero gravity meetings. We could rent the NASA Vomit Comet and have some, out of this world strategy sessions. You can see the puns are just about to start flowing here. We could hire a fortune teller, have them weigh in on, industry trends using a crystal ball or tarot cards or whatever. And then my personal favorite would be to install a moat in the executive floor with alligators. Security is a concern, so why not a moat with alligators? the point of all this, other than trying to get some cheap laughs, is really just to showcase that all of those suggestions make a lot more sense than what we're actually doing, which is essentially just throwing money out of a window. And actually, having said that, the physical act of throwing cash out of a window would actually be more entertaining than knowing that I'm spending money on software that we're not even using. So let's take a poll. How many of you here have shadow IT in your environment? Okay, that's a trick question. That's all of you. All of you have shadow IT in your environment. The real question is, how many of you would say that you have this sprawl under control? Griff, how are you controlling your SaaS sprawl today? Small group, careful observation. Okay, not bad. Not trying to, dime anyone out. Anyone else feel that they've got a winning strategy to contain SaaS sprawl? No worries. Thank you, Griff. Appreciate your bravery for volunteering. The problem is that there are really only three paths that you can go down to try to manage the SaaS sprawl. And unfortunately, all of them are fraught with issues. So there's really no easy approach, but I'll kind of delve into each one of them and, talk about the pros and cons. So first and foremost, there is the option to ignore this problem. And really that's what we did for the longest time. SaaS sprawl really wasn't on our radar. Even if the adoption of web apps was on our radar, back when I was I don't know why I'm making myself shorter, but much younger in IT, I would hear people say stuff like, web application risk is not part of our risk calculation because there's no efficient way to quantify the risk. And even then, it kind of had me scratching my head like that doesn't even make sense. And how does that even fly in, common discussion? I can tell you from experience that is not a viable path. You will get owned via one of those apps, especially if you're just burying your head in the sand. And when you do, you will spend a ridiculous amount of time trying to figure out what happened and then how are you going to recover from that. And I know this because I have done it. I've been in organizations where we ignored this risk. And then sure enough, we get owned and we're like, well, what the hell happened? And what are we going to do about it? And it results in some trauma inducing experiences for sure. So don't ignore the problem. It certainly will not end well. Hopefully everyone's on the same page with not ignoring the problem. You could enable this rapid application adoption. I mean, this is by far the most difficult path, I believe, but I think it's going to net you the most positive results. If you can get it right, because this encourages innovation. This brings your users into the conversation and allows you to produce whatever your company produces quicker because you're getting a quicker time to value. People are choosing the tools that they want to use to get their job done. And again, it just fosters a healthier discourse between you and your users. Your employees are happier and you're probably sitting there going, well, Garrett, it's not my job to make sure that my users are happy, but actually it is because happy users will actually adhere to your acceptable use policy. Studies have shown that they'll adhere to other policies, a higher proclivity for them to do that as well. But as I mentioned, this is extremely difficult to do. We'll talk later about some different approaches of how I recommend that we actually do this, because again, that's the path that I recommend. You could also just lock everything down. This unfortunately, on the surface, it seems like the most secure option, right? You're just going to stymie a little innovation, no big deal, right? Of course, it's a big deal, or I wouldn't have set it up like that. But like a bloomin' onion from my favorite international exotic restaurant, the Outback Steakhouse, there are layers to this big deal. We'll start at the defender's dilemma, and it's funny because Kyle is actually talking about the defender's dilemma. Everyone familiar with the defender's dilemma? As a defender, you have to be right 1,000 times out of 1,000. As an attacker, you only have to be right once. So it's kind of on you. But the difference here is instead of you versus 1,000 attackers, this is you versus thousands of probably highly privileged users that, people in theory, you want them to be successful at their job because, if they are successful in doing their job, make the company money, everyone stays employed, stuff like that. So the point I'm making is it's not the same as versus an attacker where you're trying to lengthen that kill chain or that attack chain and get them to give up. It's, you want to kind of encourage them to be able to do their job. But even if we look at this from a practical standpoint, you're going to block everything. Just around the room, how's that worked out for us in the past? Just blatantly blocking everything doesn't really work, right? I mean, let's dive into that a little bit. How will you make sure that no one's adopting this technology without your knowledge? You could look at the network, try to lock the network down. Well, what if they're not on your network? I mean, what is a network today? You know, it's all of these and all of your laptops, and it's home internet, and it's cafes and co-working space. You know, they could just hop on guest Wi-Fi. You don't have that in your environment. Again, like I said, a coffee shop or hotspot or something like that. You could leverage endpoint controls, but you know, like I just said, they could use a personal device. They could hop on a tablet or a mobile phone to access the SaaS information and put you in the same potential risk, you know, crosshairs of an attack. You could leverage an always-on VPN. Everyone familiar with what that is? Kind of have to force routing of traffic through home office. Did you know that these always-on VPN solutions have a pause button? For if the VPN infrastructure is not viable, you can just pause this, and there's nothing stopping you from just pausing that repeatedly. And I know, and I love that I'm saying this on a recorded line, but I worked for a vendor that produced one of the most prevalent always on VPN solutions. And even us that were on the security team, we would just pause that thing repeatedly. So that certainly doesn't work. What about getting in good with accounts payable, having them message out to you when someone tries to expense something? That's a tactic that I've used in the past, but I mean, think about it. By that time, the damage has already been done. The things that you're trying to prevent, they've already transpired. So it's a little too late. So the point that I'm trying to make here is just from a practical standpoint, these blocking methods, they don't work. Like I said, they're too little too late. You're never going to see the full scope of usage out there. And even if you did, intervening after the fact is just not going to net you positive results. It's not going to stop the majority of things that you're trying to prevent, like file share or sensitive code repo access, theft of credentials or other logins, or creating infrastructure that could be used as an initial access point. So my point being is just blocking just doesn't work. But even from a political standpoint, I can tell you from my own experience, this is not a viable path. I can't speak for all organizations that are represented here, but I can tell you that when it was Garrett's multi-factor authentication policy against a sales executive trying to win a deal at the end of the quarter, and I'll delve off in that a little bit. Some of the sales engineering team had, in this one environment, had provided remote access to a production instance to show off, some functionality in this product that we were selling. And I was, I kind of freaked out about that. And they were like, no, this stays. Like, this is the only way to do this. We had a what we'll call a come to Jesus meeting and worked on that one for sure. But initially it was 100% like, no, sales wins. Like, we're doing this. If you're, remote access policy versus an engineering leader, again, trying to support the sale of a deal at the end of the quarter, it doesn't work. So you may see some initial success from this blocking strategy, but in the long run, it's not a viable path. It's not going to work out, eventually for you. But really blocking is much, much worse than all of that. Real quick, any parents in the room? Okay, how many of you used to be children? That's all of us. What's the one thing that a parent can do to ensure that their child will do the thing that they don't want them to do? Tell them not to do it, exactly. So if you think that all of us are anything other than just larger versions of our earlier self, I mean, I've got some shocking information for you. We actually did a behavioral study recently or maybe a year and a half ago with Duke University, where we had our participants taken through the following scenario. You need to access a file from a partner outside your org to complete an important task. The partner is going to send you a secure email link to access the file from an online file sharing app that we call DocuBox, which I think as an aside, I think we thought we were making up a company, but turns out I think that's a real company. But then you have to click the link in this email to access this file. It's a pretty common transaction. These participants were then randomly assigned a intervention condition. And then afterwards, we, asked them about how they felt about this from a perceptive point, emotionally how they felt, and then behaviorally, kind of what would they do next. Well, the first condition I'll take you through, think of this as like a DNS filter, like Umbrella or something like that. It was blocked from just visiting the web page, a big red page, no explanation given, just like you can't visit this site. Okay. The second condition, this was to simulate receiving a notification from the security team saying that this activity was, violating your acceptable use policy. Your account was suspended automatically. You should be ashamed of yourself. We're going to call your mom, stuff like that. It actually didn't do any of the latter stuff, but the intent was to let them know that this was a violation. They were in violation of policy. You could infer that a violation could lead to termination, other disciplinary actions. So this was not meant to be a pleasant experience. That's my point on that. The third condition was a much more reasonable or maybe even friendlier message to the user saying, hey, we noticed you're using this application. It's something we haven't seen before. Can you help us understand why you chose to adopt that technology, and just kind of start that conversation? Well, to no one's surprise, our results were conclusive and showed that the more reasonable the participants felt about this intervention, the more likely they were to comply with our security policy. And then conversely, the more negatively the participants felt about this interaction, the least likely they were to comply. And then directly related to the stat that we discussed earlier, 67% of participants would look for a workaround if access were to be blocked. And again, that shouldn't be surprising earlier. Or that shouldn't be surprising either. We talked about this earlier. So blocking does not work, and having a more reasonable interaction with your user about this whole transaction, what apps they should use, it's just going to net you much more positive results in, the near term and the long term as well. So let's talk about how we used to adopt technology. Everyone here has probably been in IT and security in a while, but remember when I said something about, back when I started in IT, we had it all under control? Well, yeah, that's because everything that you wanted from a technology perspective originated from the IT team. You want a web server to host video for an event. I mean, that was, either racking and stacking or, provisioning space in a hypervisor. You want a software license? Well, that was either me provisioning you a license in a piece of software that I administrated, or buying it with the IT credit card. Security software, well, of course, that was always an appliance back in the day. So of course I was installing that. You want a TV? Well, that was me too. So the point I'm saying is if technology was introduced into an environment, it was by my hands and I knew about it because I was usually the one that had to deploy and configure that. So as time went on, we saw that technology became easier to adopt by end users. We saw, a few examples of pockets of people adopting technology on their own. But even then, it was few and far between. Most folks, again, were going to IT for this central provisioning. You fast forward to today, however, where SaaS is the predominant form factor for this technology, and it's almost flipped on its head. And as the scary stats that I showed earlier, almost all cloud technology is adopted without any kind of IT oversight. So what does that look like today? Well, as it's discussed and inferred, it's largely decentralized at this point. You may have a concept of a central control, but even then, after the software is provisioned, it's very quickly handed off to whoever admins that business unit, whether it's like, sales administrating a customer contact software, or marketing with a, customer contact software, whatever. But the vast majority of organizations have all their users adopting technology themselves. In fact, most software vendors today count on that. It's part of their sales strategy. It even has a fancy name. It's called product-led growth, or PLG. They want users to go out and try the software on their own, get hooked, spread, it sounds like a cigarette company, get hooked, spread the use to their friends, and then that software vendor intervenes and says, hey, it looks like you've got 20 people using our software. Do you want to upgrade to the pro license where we can consolidate all that use? So the normal mode that we see today is a user will find this tech that they want to try, definitely not asking us first. They'll usually evaluate that solution in a test environment, which, that's its own, its own debacle, I suppose, because they're usually in, not a test environment. It's usually in production. It's usually hooked up to potentially sensitive access, stuff like that, which as an aside, that's its own kind of troubling thing, because most people look at something and say, well, this app or server or database doesn't have any sensitive data in it, so I'm fine hooking up this piece of evaluation software, and they don't think about the ramifications of that like we do, but that's our problem. So back to the user, if they decide that they want to purchase or officially use this software, only then will they seek approval from us in IT and security. But as discussed, it's way too late at this point. The app is already integrated with your business practices. You're already storing and or sharing potentially sensitive data. And then, your team members, or their team members rather, have already become aware, and they've started using this software as well at that point. So if you come in heavy-handed at this point, you just look like a jerk. That's where the whole concept of like the Department of No comes into play. And blocking at this stage is either going to result in, disgruntled employees and or circumvention of your controls like we talked about earlier. And that's the kind of stuff that in my experience has bred either people leaving the organization or even sometimes insider threats if they feel so, thwarted. And, as I talked about earlier, in addition to this shift from a very centralized to a decentralized model, the SaaS use is accelerating at an alarming rate. Reuters reported, I don't know, like a year and a half ago, ChatGPT, everyone's favorite content writer, they were estimated to have reached 100 million monthly active users 2 months after launch. If anyone here in this room or online tracks monthly active user stats, that is an alarming statistic. That is absolute insane growth. So the point is, whatever load or demand issue that you're under right now, that's kind of intertwined with this application onboarding process, it's only going to get worse unless you change your approach to manage and mitigate this adoption of technology. So what risk does this SaaS sprawl even present? Well, the main risk is, as I've stated previously, it's just we're not applying the same level of scrutiny or control to these SaaS applications that you would for on-prem technology, or maybe those security controls are reserved for only the most critical, SaaS applications. But anyone who's ever had to deal with that understand that they're all critical. They all provide an access point. Usually what this means is we don't know what SaaS apps are actually in use. And that's a common problem. That's a problem that most folks have. Or, we don't have any security for our SaaS applications, which is even more alarming. And that approach is as ridiculous as like the defense in depth approach that I know we all kind of subscribed to 15 years ago. And by the way, if you do think that defense in depth works, we can talk after the meeting. It definitely does not. Most folks that are attacking SaaS applications, though, have one goal in mind, and that is to harvest tokens from cookies, access tokens. Everyone here should be very familiar with token authentication, but if you're not, it makes authenticating into apps a lot easier without actually sharing credentials. But as a trade-off, as we interconnect and automate, more of these applications, some of them, we're creating tokens that bypass our security controls, bypass MFA, bypass SSO, stuff like that. And that's what really gets us in trouble. You could do a whole day's worth of talks on token auth risk, but I'll kind of put a pin in that there. We saw this behavior in several breaches in the past. Everyone remember the 2021 Electronic Arts breach? Hackers stole a bunch of intellectual property. It was actually in development video games. I think it was FIFA, which again, what a ridiculous target, but whatever. And they held this intellectual property ransom for $28 million. I think the settle price was less than that, but still, that was the original asking price. And this was all the result of stolen Slack cookies. They bought some on an online marketplace called Genesis for initial access. They used some social engineering to get more access for other employees within Slack. It's actually kind of slick. So they contacted the help desk via Slack and took a page out of my book and said, oh, I was at a party last night and I lost my phone, and I really need to get in and make this commit to this project or else I'm going to get fired. So of course, the help desk granted them that token, and they used that token to get initial access. And then, it was a token to actually bypass multi-factor authentication, allowed them to make their way eventually through escalation of privileges, made their way into production systems. And by the way, there are industries that are, yes,
How did they get the info flag?
they bought them from an online marketplace on the dark web called Genesis. But the point I'm about to make is like, there are so many marketplaces now for this.
How would those be stolen in first? That would be the initial compromise. That would be great.
Yeah, I mean, there's malware that's built specifically for that called info stealers. It'll go and harvest tokens. You can phish someone, get them to install an info stealer, and then Bob's your uncle. And those transactions are usually very quickly. The higher price for more valuable tokens are fresher, expired, or older tokens really don't cost that much. Any other questions on that? Good, great question. But yeah, just what I was saying, there are industries that are built on top of this possibility of this happening. Dedicated markets to buy and sell. Like I said, there's malware that's specifically written for this. And the beauty today in 2024 is you don't even have to write this malware. You can just buy it as well. That's available on the dark web. Does anyone want to hazard a guess how much that token cost to gain access into EA and ransom their? Close, $10. $10 for one token that allowed them to hold ransom for $28 million. So just kind of making the point that it doesn't require that much money to start an attack campaign that can have immeasurable ramifications. Circle CI, which is a continuous integration, like code build automation type thing. They had a breach as well. Same thing. Malware was loaded on a developer's machine. It harvested cookies, extracted tokens, which included a valid MFA-backed session via SSO, which gave attackers access to the Circle CI private repos. The problem was with that is because they were authenticated as an engineer, the attacker was able to create more access tokens and then escalate privileges, get into production environments, which very quickly led them to customer environments, which is arguably the worst possible outcome from an attack like that. Slack had their own breach in 2022. They actually had some segmentation set up, which was pretty smart between them and their customer environments, which they were able to access private Slack GitHub repos, but were not able to traverse to customer environments. What do all these attacks have in common? Well, first and foremost, these attacks went largely unnoticed at first due to lack of visibility or control or awareness, whatever you want to call it, of their SaaS estate. They weren't keeping track of what tokens were in use, what third-party tools were dependent or were interconnected to these other applications. And in several cases, these vendors were only made aware of this breach when the attackers reached out for their ransom. So again, this is all kind of a result of not keeping tabs on how these apps are interconnected, how we're authenticating with these apps, who's signing up for what, so on and so forth. Another just kind of inherent risk of this SaaS sprawl that I mentioned previously is that since there are so many apps introduced these days, a lot of IT teams can't keep up and they just lose track of these apps that are being adopted. I mean, let's be honest, most teams don't try to keep up with this adoption of SaaS app technology. And it's not because they don't care. It's just because they think that it's impossible. And at some point it starts to look like a waste of time. And anyone here who's run security or IT teams knows that you're measuring your progress by metrics. And if you're constantly failing over and over again, one way to perceive that would be that this is a fruitless endeavor and we should concentrate on other things because we only have so many bodies to tackle these problems. Again, more of a kind of burying your head in the sand type approach, but regardless, it certainly happens. There are also third and fourth party risks and issues. We saw this with, unfortunately, the Ticketmaster and the Santander breach that we saw recently. Because if you're not able to keep up with the applications that are being introduced, I would hazard a guess that you're not able to keep up with the third and fourth party integrations with other tools that vendors are using to process your data. A great example of this would be every app under the sun is adding AI technology to their offering. If you're monitoring for the classification of apps that are being introduced and you're laser focused on AI being adopted into your organization, well, Asana might fly under your radar because that's a project management tool. But Asana added ChatGPT and Anthropic to their offering recently. And depending on how that's being used, that could put you in the same risk profile as someone just straight up slinging private data into, a generative AI prompt like ChatGPT. So keeping track of those third-party risks is also paramount to, trying to defend yourself, and kind of encompasses this whole awareness play. An example of this that we saw was the SurveyMonkey attack. You don't have to be a SurveyMonkey customer to receive surveys. Hopefully everyone knows that. Threat actors compromised their app, which is actually their production survey environment, and they sent phishing emails in the form of surveys out to SurveyMonkey customers or recipients saying, well, here's this survey, but this is a special one, so you need to log in with your Google or Office creds, which of course was just a way to steal credentials. And these surveys came straight from surveymonkey.com, so it bypassed a lot of reputation type filters and alerting. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, there are solutions that address this, but I can tell you that in my experience, I worked in environments to where, we either couldn't afford that type of solution, or we had bigger fish to fry, getting MFA or single sign-on distributed without the environment. So I never used these tools. The really only way to address these types of issues is quick dissemination when a breach happens. You find out that the breach happened in a third-party tool, be on the lookout for any kind of communications from either of these tools, treat them with a little extra scrutiny, and of course, continued education of your users on how to and how not to interact with emails that are asking for information, how to spot origin, how to, validate that this came from a trusted source, stuff like that. I love that. I have no idea why I included this graphic, but it was kind of cool looking. Another risk that people seem to, another risk to this application adoption is that people seem to point the finger a lot. This is not my problem. This is someone else's problem. A lot of lying to yourselves and stuff like that. We hear things like, I have my hands full with what I know about, which every time I hear that, I'm just befuddled and it's directly related to what I was talking about earlier with, we don't have a way to an effective way to quantify or identify this web app usage. So what? It's not going to help you in a breach. It's not going to be a mitigating factor if your organization is found to have been negligent. In fact, I think you get double sued when you say things like that. That's really bad. There are a lot of myths surrounding the shared responsibility security model when you're using an application. Everyone here familiar with what a shared responsibility security model is? AWS pioneered that back in the day. Basically, we're going to cover the security up to the application layer, all the physical premises, stuff like that. We'll handle that. But everything beyond that, that's your responsibility. And we're not liable or culpable for anything that happens around that. We saw this somewhat recently in Salesforce. I don't know if anyone remembers. Salesforce had a very easily misconfigured security setting in one of the areas of the product. I won't go into detail about it. That it resulted in a ton private data being leaked by a bunch of government organizations. Brian Krebs, who hopefully everyone's familiar with Brian Krebs, he blew the lid off of this, contacted a bunch of these government institutions that they found were leaking the data. And what was surprising is a lot of cases, they were very quick to blame Salesforce. They're quick to blame the vendor. One of these agencies actually really went the extra mile and said something like, these sites were set up during the pandemic. They didn't go through our normal security review process. We didn't have access to Salesforce developers, yada, yada, yada. Again, just pointing the finger at someone else. I think we can all guess what Salesforce's reply was. It's not our fault. That's not a vulnerability. That's a misconfiguration. What's even worse is they had already published guidance on how to avoid setting up this misconfiguration. So of course, there's no culpability on their end. The last one, kind of the last, fallacy that we see a lot is, if I put a policy out there and the employee violates it, well, that's their problem. What? I mean, the IT and security will never win here, because even if it is their problem, it's also your problem, because you're left, kind of dealing with the fallout there. Maybe a little bit of a tangent, but I'm wondering why or how is it that a lot of people feel so comfortable with this unmanaged risk that shadow IT presents? I mean, even at the executive and board level, And by comfortable, I mean they're willing to accept this risk. I hear, and before you say, oh, but Garrett, my organization does care about this, I will tell you that you're in the minority. Most folks that I talk to in executive leadership, they're either not aware of the issue, or that's what they're telling me, or this unmanaged SaaS risk just isn't perceived as that big of a threat. It's not as important as the other, traditional security challenges that we see out there. When does it become important to these folks? When they're breached. And then hindsight is 2020, but again, you're kind of left picking up the pieces at that case. So again, a little bit of a tangent, but even just at the risk level, it can still be perceived as like an acceptable risk, which I'm here to tell you it's definitely not. So I want to share with you, I think we have enough time, some of my personal horror stories kind of associated with this type of behavior. I had a gig where I walked in and they had this long tail approval process for the use of applications. It was a Google form that fed into, or it probably wasn't a Google form, it's probably Microsoft, but fed into a spreadsheet. The length of approval process was on average about 2 months, which again, as we talked about earlier with the stats, if you have a 2-month approval process and you have a deadline in 2 weeks, what are you going to do? You're probably not going to go through the approval process. There was no discovery of SaaS application use. The only time that we really found out that these applications were in use was when billing was audited, or someone came to accounts payable trying to get something, a bill paid. The big problem though is that the IT team that I walked into to work with, they felt that this was acceptable. Problem is that no one else in the organization found that this was acceptable, so obviously they just skirted that approval process. This essentially led to all of the work, and because there was a ton of work put into this, a lot of manual work, but it was all for nothing because again, most of the stuff that would get us owned was just completely unknown by the IT team. We had a big problem with AWS sprawl. AWS was a main cloud environment in an organization that I worked in. We had all the flavors, but AWS was certainly the dominant one. Thankfully, there was an EDR solution in play when I waltzed into this gig. And when we would get owned on an instance, it would report that this was an AWS. It would give me an AWS account number. But the problem is that this organization had undergone so much change and acquired so many companies. Each one of them came to the table with their own handful of AWS environments, but no one thought to inventory them. No one thought to aggregate them into a master list or in due diligence or anything like that. So, I had discovered an entire organization of shadow IT that I didn't even know about. What's funny is the engineering team in this org had actually lost so much faith in IT that they created their own IT org. They called it DevOps, but it was 100% just their own IT organization. And none of this infrastructure was under IT's purview. IT didn't really know about it. So it was essentially like a completely fractured and segregated organization. So I would see these AWS accounts come up during these EDR alerts, and more often than not, I had no idea who owned this AWS account. So I didn't have anyone to reach out to say, what is this? Can we shut it down? I need help on this. One thing that kind of compounded that problem is that in addition to this infrastructure not being merged, the engineering teams, they weren't merged either. They actually operated not as a single organization, but a group of individual factions. They actually called themselves tribes, and they engaged in tribal war. This is their word, not mine. They engaged in tribal warfare all the time, pointing the finger and assigning blame to one another. So every time I'd get one of these EDR alerts, I didn't recognize the account number. I'd have to message out to each one of those teams in individual Slack channels and basically shout out into the void going, is this yours? Is this yours? And of course, no one would reply to me. How effective do you think I was at that? Not very at all. I was able to find a solution that did help me discover all this AWS infrastructure. And I had way more than I thought. We'll just leave it at that. Another organization that I worked in, also very engineering led, which meant that engineering just did whatever they wanted to. Like most orgs, we found that we were using some, software or open source tools that had some vulnerabilities that were discovered. I mean, that happens to everyone. But due to the fractured nature of this org as well, there was no centralized understanding of what all was in use amongst all these teams. So again, when one of these vulns came to light, I had to do the same thing as I did with the rogue cloud accounts. I had to message out to every single one of these engineering teams and say, do you use this? Do you use Spring? Do you use whatever? This took forever. It was painful and frustrating for everyone involved. And, it just left us exposed to attacks for an unacceptable amount of time. Couple more juicy ones that I could go into, but I think I'll move on just due to time. Some mitigation and risk reduction strategies that I believe do not work. Kind of a review of what we talked about earlier. Manual and approval and application intake. It's not going to work out. We talked about this before. There's way too many apps being added at an alarming rate for you to manually intake and improve all these applications. I mean, you could try it, but you're not going to be able to do it in an efficient manner that's conducive to business. You could look at the network, but again, what's a network in 2024? Most organizations don't have a concept of a network these days. So again, what are you going to do? Implement one of those always on VPN solutions? No. You could do a CASB. Everyone familiar with CASB? I think it's cloud access security broker type technology. Those work really, really well. You can get a lot of detail about the application use, but that's for apps that you know about. Even for CASB solutions that have a discovery component, it's usually only relegated to the network. So the only things that are on the network are you able to actually discover. You could try to lock the environment down, but we already talked about that. Locking the environment down may net you some initial success, but in the long term, it's just probably going to blow up in your face. So what I think, in my opinion, is if you want to get serious about understanding the technology that's in use in your environment, you need to start with discovery and visibility. Obviously, we've learned this from asset management in the past. You can't manage what you don't know about. You can't, secure those things as well. But the problem is it needs to be continuous. I know I dogged on using spreadsheets earlier, but the problem isn't necessarily the use of the spreadsheet itself. I mean, I think you should get off a spreadsheet as soon as possible, but the problem is that there's usually a very large effort put into the initial discovery and classification of these applications, but then as time goes on, that adherence to that kind of falls off. Majority of folks have a hard time curating this data, so it's just not a long-term viable solution. There are solutions out there that help with this discovery and kind of, fast curation. I do work for one of those companies, but not here to sell you my product. I'm here to sell you on the approach of, recognizing that the discovery and the visibility is the problem. So regardless of how you do this, you need to be able to discover the use of new applications as soon as users are signing up for those accounts. And then, again, various ways of doing this, but, your mileage may vary there. I think ours is probably the best, but I'm obviously biased. But then as soon as you get that discovery process in play, you need a way to automate the process of gathering information about these applications. I mean, if you're getting 60 new apps introduced into your environment, going out and researching all these apps and classifying them just, again, is not viable for most of us that are in smaller security teams. You can use bots that'll go out and crawl the internet for information about the application. The vendor's own website will usually net you a lot of information about the app, their security presence, how they treat privacy. Also comes in really handy when you're trying to identify sub-processors of data, because they'll usually, I don't think in the US it's mandated, but they will usually list what other utilities and applications are using to act as sub-processors of your data, which can be, again, very advantageous. You can ask your users, hey, why'd you sign up for this app? And what kind of data does this touch? And how long have you been using it? And stuff like that. But that's a really difficult process to maintain manually. So if you could have some sort of automated message that goes out via email or Slack or Teams or whatever, that fires off as soon as that app is added to ask them why, you can start to automatically, catalog and collect that information. You can harvest a lot of information about an application when it's provisioned via your identity provider or via single sign-on solutions, especially when you're talking about OAuth and permissions that are granted when integrations between two apps happen. A couple minutes left, no worries. We didn't talk much about OAuth. I don't have time to do that, but most folks treat it like a EULA. The thing pops up and you go, yeah, that sounds great. I need to use that. And then the last part, I just want to reiterate that this needs to be a continuous process. You have to continuously curate your SaaS app estate and monitor for any kind of changes. And again, I've seen a lot of examples where people start out very strong in this endeavor, but then they get tired, bored, they don't see the value, and that use kind of drops off and they move on to another initiative. So, what we all see time and time again is as soon as you let your guard down, that's when you get owned. So my point is here, this needs to be someone's job. Doesn't need to be their entire job, but needs to be, defined within their remit. If you're in a small team, automate this. So where I'll end in summary is that, just to kind of catch up, this decentralized adoption of technology, this is the new reality. The known, way of managing this technology does not work in this new reality. So if you perceive this as a problem, it's only going to get worse from here. And, my advice is the only choice here is to adapt and evolve to this kind of growing problem. That's all I have for today. Any questions, any follow-ups?
Thank you, Garrett.
Thanks, Kate.
Yes, thanks, Alex. Thanks, Garrett, for this.
Any questions? Awesome. Nice.
Anyone in the room have any questions for him?
Debates? I'll entertain Star
Complaints,
Trek The Next
entertainment?
Generation trivia. No? Okay, cool.
Oh, make him.
Not quite a debate, but I think I very much love the discover and nudge model. And I know Russ from many years ago, so we're friends. I think the challenge is it's also a mindset shift for the security team, because where I've seen this, even if you get the discovery, if your leadership is like, oh, you found this, block it, you're back to the punitive model, right? And so you really have to shift your complete mindset around this away from punishing the customer to embracing that the customer is right and you want to help them be right in a more secure way. And that's a much different paradigm shift. I think less of a shift for the practitioners of security and more of a shift for security leadership.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I certainly can't take credit for this, but we need to shift from a department of no to a department of how. How can we help you achieve this goal? Because, blocking can be an eventuality. You're talking about remote access tools, like, sorry, we got to block those, but let's figure out a way for you to get access to whatever you're trying to access. Because again, if you just patently block the thing, like you said, we're back to that mode where people are going to be like, well, forget you, I'm going to figure out a way around it. I mean, I built the beginning of my career around figuring out ways around that. So I couldn't agree more. Great point. Anyone else?
Okay, there's two questions online. I don't know what they are.
Okay. So one person wants to, well, I'll read the question. So it was stated that defense in depth doesn't work. Why not? Well, because defense in depth involves the concept of a perimeter, but what is a perimeter today? Again, we've got our mobile phones, we've got, personal hotspots, we've got home internet. And one of the problems with that is that security coverage, no matter how comprehensive that is in your organization, almost never extends to these remote networks, your home, cafes, things like that. So another kind of problem with that is with defense in depth, you start to bury your head in the sand saying, well, we've got our perimeter secured, so we don't have to worry about that. We've listed only the apps that we need, so we're good with that. And you just kind of start to rely on those security controls. And once you do that and ignore, this kind of ever-present threat of rapid technology adoption, that's when you get owned. So I'm not saying that defense in depth isn't a complement to an organization's security posture, but relying on that is certainly not a long-term tenable strategy. Seth, hopefully that answers your question. Bertrand asks, how critical are SAST and DAST in SaaS assessments? Well, what I would recommend is that you ask the vendor, are they doing penetration testing on their applications? Are they running static code analysis? Are they running web app pen tests? I've not found that it's very viable to do a penetration test on an application as I'm adopting them into my environment. For a multitude of reasons. The cost of a penetration test, especially an effective one, you might be able to do that on a couple of critical apps and might not be a bad idea. But again, that rapid adoption just won't allow you to cover the bases for all the technology that's being introduced and get penetration testing on that. So what I would advise to you, Seth, or sorry, to Bertrand, is that you ask the vendors, well, you know, what kind of certifications do you have? Do you have a SOC 2 Type 2? Do you have a recent penetration test of your application? Can you talk about the security of your production environment? Things of that nature. I think that'll net you the results that you're looking for as far as elucidating how secure, you know, that application is in use. But I would argue that no matter how secure that organization treats their application, your users are still that weakest link that will provide the openings that attackers are looking for. Great questions. Anything else from the room or from chat? Cool.
Sounds quiet. So sounds like we want to say thank you again to Garrett for doing this.
Thanks so much for your time, folks.
That should conclude our meeting, and anybody in the room, make sure you check out the book deck back here in the back of the room that Griff is giving out, especially if you want to get your CISSP. I see the Sean Harris book and everything else like that. So some very, very good books back here that he's giving away for free. Otherwise, we will hopefully see you at the happy hour or next month at the chapter meeting. Thank you all.